Egypt is now a memory. Egypt is now a memory. We'll see the significance of that in a second. So let's see what happens once they get freed from the clutches of Pharaoh. What do? Let's see in reading number 15.
The whole congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The sons of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill us, to kill this whole assembly with hunger."
Well, I said that Egypt is now a memory, and so they're remembering, would that we had died in Egypt when we sat by the pots of meat, when we ate bread to the full. If you read the accounts of their slavery in Egypt, do you get the impression that they were just so well fed? Are slaves ordinarily fed to the full with bread? In other words, a key note here is that the first thing they do once they get into the desert of decision is they start looking back in their memory, and their memory deceives them. Their memory deceives them about the past. It's a false memory, and they start. Well, let's take up the next reading. Number what is it? Number 16. To see how this goes on.
Then the congregation of the sons of Israel journeyed by stages from the wilderness of Sin, according to the command of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. But the people thirsted there for water, and they grumbled against Moses and said, "Why now have you brought us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?"
All right. So there's first of all their problem is with hunger. They're hungry in the first reading, and the second one now they're thirsty. And both of these readings, we note this. In the first one, you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Okay. Now remember what I said last night about the repetition of things? Repetition of things? How important it is to pay attention? You have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Why now have you brought us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? So they lodge this objection against the Lord that we're hungry, you must have brought us out here to kill us. We're thirsty, you must have brought us out here to kill us. What does that have to do with the promise? What are the two aspects of the promise? All right, what does this say about the promise? You brought us out here to kill us.
They lost their faith
In what?
in the promise.
But what aspect of it? If you're going to be killed, if he's going to bring us out here to kill, then he's obviously not very serious about the descendants that he promised to Abraham. Look at the stars in the sky. Count it if you can. And you brought us out here to kill us. So this is this very deep reaction against the fundamental promise of the God that has just set them free from slavery. Right? Just led them out of slavery. And the next reading. Let me just take one thing from it. Why have you made us come up from Egypt to bring us to this wretched place? This wretched place. It is not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there water to drink. This wretched place. What does that have to do with the promise? Descendants, you brought us here to kill us, and this is a wretched place. In other words, you're not serious about the promised land, right? So this right, it's almost instinctively, they start, and the word is murmuring, complaining. But murmuring is that word. And there's this other word that is very, very important for us, because I could cite pages of this murmuring against God. I'd be really selective and just cut it down to a few. This is a theme of the time in the desert, is this precisely this complaint against God, this murmuring against God. And notice it's not only individuals, it's a communal thing. That is to say, they grumbled in their tent, and then they'd go out and talk to their neighbor, and the grumbling just contagious, It's contagious, this murmuring against God. It's St. Paul a number of times will talk about that murmuring. Avoid murmuring, avoid complaining. And St. Francis de Sales is the patron saint of this diocese, a man whom I deeply, deeply respect and admire. And I was just reading the other day about it. It's typical. One of the things he was most firm on is that people simply, he says, he makes it kind of exaggerated, there's virtually no grounds for complaining. He wants it, in our daily life, there are indeed, of course, the Israelites complained against God in Egypt about their state of slavery. And this rose to heaven, This rose to heaven and was answered. They're now complaining against God for His provision, for His providence. It's a complaint against providence. About the things that Jesus says, your Father knows you need these things, food and drink. Any Father in heaven that doesn't provide this is not even worth thinking about. So it goes without saying that He will do this. He knows you need these things. They complain about this constantly. And St. Francis says that in our own life, so often we have something that puts us sideways with somebody, and we need to tell somebody about it. We need to complain about it. And then we tell one person, and that just kind of whets the appetite to tell somebody, oh, look what's happened to me. Look what's happened to me. Look what's happened to me. And it just whets itself, and then the next day, somebody else comes up, wait, I haven't told that person, so I tell that person, And this is often about the most trivial things, isn't it? The most trivial things that really, and what it does is kind of like this bubble, just like this bubble that kind of grows, and it just, it's just empty. Empty kind of we talked about illusion last night. This is an example of the cultivation of an illusion, a self-illusion about ourselves. Is that we're being mistreated or whatever, and maybe we are. And we may well be, St. Francis says, we may well be mistreated. After all, we are mistreated day and night. We mistreat others and they mistreat us. But the question is, how do we deal with it, and does this do any good whatsoever, other than to get us more upset, to lose our peace of soul? And so we could come indirectly, I think through this we could come to a considerable consideration of the passion of the Lord, when He has all these, a very, very central part of the passion of the Lord is His public humiliation. Public humiliation. When he's crucified there's 360 degrees, people on all sides. Save yourself if you can. They hurl these horrible insults to Him. Of course, earlier in His passion, when He's been accused, he opens not His mouth. And they're astonished. Well, don't you have anything to say? Don't you have anything to say? And then finally, in a couple of accounts, he will briefly give a very brief defense. But this is, of all the life of our Lord, the Passion is the great, great school. St. Thomas Aquinas says, if you don't have anything else, just look at the Passion of the Lord. You'll find every virtue you ever need right there. And I think that I want to make the point, though, without going on about this, is right here in this desert of decision, this is the first thing that comes up. This complaining about our lot, complaining fruitlessly. And it also is contagious. It is contagious, it spreads to others, and it does absolutely no good. Absolutely no good. And it's a key thing here that notice I said that Egypt is now just a memory. That's one of the things that's handy about this geography, it seems to me, is you can literally place yourself and orient yourself in time and place. The location in time and place says something about time. That this Egypt is now past time. And therefore, it is the function of the memory to deal with it. Huh? We're going to see in the future, in a little while, when we turn to the Promised Land, it's pure imagination. They haven't been there yet. And that's another problem, as we'll see. But this is a problem, and it just allows me to make the point here that there are the faculties of the soul, the four faculties of the soul: the mind, the memory, the intellect, the memory, the intellect, and the will. Okay, and I would add imagination. I kind of think that's a separate factor. The intellect, the mind, the memory, imagination, and the will. We could spend a whole hour on this, but I just want to briefly suggest that if you were Satan and you wanted to bring about the downfall of the human person, which one of those would you attack first? Imagination? I'm basing this on the scriptural record. It's very, very clear, I think.
Memory.
Isn't that the evidence here? No? The evidence here is that they no sooner get into the desert than Satan goes against their memory, which is in line with the very beginning in the Garden of Eden, when Satan, the serpent, talks to Eve. What's the first thing he says to her? Didn't God say? Didn't God say? So what is he appealing to at that point? To her memory, her memory. And in fact, Eve, her memory is faulty and flawed. She does not accurately report what God has said to Adam. And because then when her memory is off, she's kind of confused, everything falls from it. So these things say to us that the state of our memory is of the fundamental importance, first primary importance. And if that weren't enough, what do we hear, and will we hear today, as we hear every day at the Eucharist, what is at the very heart of the Eucharist? The consecration, right? The repetition of the self-giving of the Lord on the night before he died. And what does he say to us there? Do this in memory of me. The Eucharist is directed explicitly to the memory. So that really, I think the combination of these things really tells us a great deal. Now, at this point I would say, I'll make reference to the fact that this is a journey, this geography of faith is a journey from slavery to freedom, to freedom, to freedom. And that word is going to sound more and more as we go along. But if that's the case, then we already learned that an absolutely vital aspect of being humanly free is the attention to our memory, the memory of what God has done for us. Before anything else. If you don't attend to that, then you're in trouble. You're in big trouble. And this has very, we'll see later at the end of the whole thing, I think we'll see that this has absolutely fundamental practical importance. Practical importance. It has to do with the life of prayer. Okay. So, is that 15 minutes? Probably is. I think. Let me just rapidly do this. We'll skip over, and you can read the text themselves. You know this story. Where does murmuring lead? Murmuring leads to rebellion. It leads to out rebellion and the making of the golden calf, falling down and worshiping a false god. That's what it leads to. It's constant. Just you can, and again, we're invited to see whether this isn't the case in our own life, which is this making, and not only making, but worshiping of a false god, worshiping a false god. And let me see here. Come, make us a god who will go before us, the people say to Aaron, as this Moses did. All the sons of Israel grumbled, murmured against Moses and Aaron in reading 19. Would that we had died in Egypt. Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? What does this say about the promise? What are the two aspects of the promise? Sin and
Promised land.
what is this return to Egypt? What does that say? Well, the promise, we're giving up on the promise. We're explicitly giving up on the promise, and we'll go back to slavery in Egypt. Now, it's important. I guess I'm glad I actually read those lines. They go on to say, "Let us appoint a leader and return to Egypt." To actually set in motion the idea to literally go back to Egypt, which is to absolutely give up on the promise. Give up on the promise. Now, this is really pretty stark and pretty clear, it seems to me, that this is the state of affairs. And I draw a conclusion from that that is not infallible, but it's the one that reflecting on that and my own experience, and that is that this is what God is disclosing to us about ourselves, is that there is something in us that wants to be a slave. There's something in us that wants to be a slave, that wants to go back to slavery. And I think we'll see the full impact of this when we consider the whole journey, but we already have enough to see that this is literally the desire that's there. Let us go back to Egypt. And the evidence for that is, I think, abundant in our time. But one of that strikes me again and again is women who are abused by men, that live with men, sometimes married, but oftentimes, increasingly in our time, that are not married and live with men, and who let men beat them bloody. Well, look at this Cleveland thing. You might say on an individual level, and maybe the door is not locked, but in effect the person is a prisoner of this monster, who just treats this person like worse than an animal. And just to think of the physical beatings and things like this, and we know this happens all the time. And so what happens so often, sadly, and I don't say this in any way to put down these women, not at all. What happens? They get free of the man. What happens then? They either oftentimes go back to the same man or go to a man who then does the same thing. That's the one that interests me, is that it's as if there's this instinctive sense that this man will treat me that same way, and somehow or other either that I deserve it or I need it. You know what I mean? It's just dark. This is all real dark stuff. And I'm sure there are other examples. That's one that strikes me as very clear. There's something about us that wants to be a slave. Wants to be a slave. Something about us that wants someone else to control my time and my place. But this is not what God wants. He doesn't want us to go in that direction. He's taken us in the other direction. We want to go back. There's something about us that wants to be a slave. And I wonder, and this is the last thing I'll say before we go, I wonder whether or not, because one can let oneself wonder, when you read Scripture, this is the way I read it, so you can do with it what you want, maybe it'll suggest ways of reading. The question that I wonder is that at the very basis of our memory, is the womb, life in the womb. When our time and our place were indeed subject to another, our mother, but everything was rosy. All our needs were met. Food and drink, the two things that were complained about, the two fundamental stuff. We had food and drink in abundance. And we rightly, somehow or other, we remember that. At some, I know there's psychiatrists and psychological studies that, at least in years past, used to look into this question. But whether at some deep level, there's something about us that yearns to go back to that. That's why in the Scriptures we could say, I think, that God placed the angels with the flaming swords at the Garden of Paradise. When all their needs were met, perfect happiness and everything like this, and then comes sin, and bingo, out you go. And the angels are placed there so that you can't go back to the garden. You cannot go back to the garden. Isn't that the attempt of communism? Is to go back to the garden. Right here on earth. can't go back. We have to, the God of Israel is a God who will lead us forward into the future. Into the future. And so if there's this, there's something in us that wants to be a slave, it is very important. If this is true, if this is what God wishes to disclose to us about ourselves, then if it's that important to Him, it ought to be important to us, to you and me. And we ought to look into our own experience and see where these dark forces are at work. To me, this is the confirmation of original sin. Confirmation of original sin. It's there. Was any of us ever born into a world that as soon as we came out, as soon as we began to have any sense of things, right at the very first, what's the first thing we do? We cry out for food. Well, that's never happened before, because it was always provided. It's as if suddenly, without knowing, I'm in a dangerous situation. There are those who will not take care of me. They will abandon me. I'll die. Oh, that I could go back to the womb. I can't. So this, I think, that's why I'm suggesting that this whole business is based on the fundamental human psychology and development, and that God then takes that, which is what He has created, and then tells us what we're capable of and where we came from and where we're going, or where we can go. That's it. That was 18 and a half minutes. Well, it's far past time to conclude for now. So we'll take this up. I'll have to do some thinking about how to move us along faster, because we're going to be in the desert forever if we don't get going.